And from the last video, you remember that we talked about thermoregulation and how the body maintains core body temperature around 37 degrees C. And so that core body temperature being the temperature around the heart, the lungs, the brain, and spinal cord. And so your body is able to manage the heat gains by muscle metabolism, basal metabolic rate, with heat losses in the environment. And we talked last time about the different routes of heat loss into the environment. And so one of the challenges to your body maintaining body heat at 37 degrees C is exercise or muscular activity, because 75% of your muscular activity is lost into the environment as heat or is used to potentially elevate your core body temperature. So unless your body can, or if your body can't lose that excess heat as into the environment, then that's going to increase your core body temperature. And so potentially 60% of the heat lost into the environment can be via evaporative sweat losses. So this is the most variable. It's can be the most significant way that your body loses heat. And and that your body's ability to lose heat into the environment, especially evaporative sweat losses, depend on the environment that you're exercising in. If you're exercising in if you're exercising at all, it's going to increase muscle temperature. That's going to increase core temperature. If the environment is hot, you're not going to lose as much body heat into the environment. So you may actually start to gain body heat. And if it's a very humid environment, you're not going to be able to lose as much body heat as sweat. And so that's going to compromise your ability to cool your body via evaporative sweat losses. But sweat being one of the major routes to lose body heat, it's one of the most significant. But we talked last time about how if you are losing sweat, that sweat comes from plasma volume, extracellular fluid, and intracellular fluid. And if you don't replace that lost body water, you can result in a state of dehydration. And so dehydration is when you're in essentially a hyperosmolar, or an increased blood solutes, and a hypovolemic or volemic or low body water concentration. And so that dehydration impairs performance. And so here's body weight lost as water, and here's exercise capacity. And so if you lose just 5% of your body weight as water from sweating, and you don't replace that, it can impair performance by 30%. It's not sufficient generally to wait until you're thirsty to start drinking, because by the time you're thirsty, you've lost about 2% of your body water, and your exercise capacity has been compromised by about 10%. And so it's important to maintain hydration, or as much as you can, prevent excessive dehydration when you're exercising, because a person that's dehydrated will always perform more poorly than someone, at least in endurance type exercises, not necessarily in power exercises, but in endurance type exercises, they'll perform more poorly than someone who's euhydrated or has sufficient body water. Another thing that happens when you're dehydrated is your ability to maintain your core body temperature at that 37 degrees is compromised. So we said that sweating was one of the major routes for us to lose excess body heat. And so what happens if you're dehydrated or your blood becomes hyperosmolar, which is increased solutes, is that your set temperature, or your the threshold temperature for you to start sweating increases. So here is someone's lost 5% of their body water volume, and essentially your sweating threshold, the point where you start to sweat, increases by almost a degree, or at least a half a degree Celsius, so that you don't start sweating until you've lost a significant amount of, or until you've gained a significant amount of core body temperature. And so this could allow you to potentially reach a dangerous temperature threshold much more quickly. This could result in heat illness, and so here's a couple definitions, and we'll talk a little bit about them. Hyperthermia is just core body temperature above these temperatures. There's also something called exercise-associated muscle cramps. These are not directly related to heat. Some individuals tend to be more susceptible to them than others. There's lots of theories, but not any good definitive theories yet on what exercise-associated muscle cramps are. They're usually painful spasms in the legs and the abdomen, so we're not going to talk about these anymore at this point. There's also something called exertional heat exhaustion, and usually this is when the athlete collapses while exercising in the heat, and so this is when they've lost a significant amount of plasma volume, they're feeling weak, their peripheral, their arms and legs are cold, they're excessively sweating, and their pulse has become weak, and they might, but they might still look flushed. And if they're not rapidly, if someone experiencing exertional heat exhaustion is not rapidly cooled in ice baths, given extra fluids, then they taken out of the hot environment, stopped exercising, then they can develop into exertional heat stroke. And so we can think about this along a continuum. And if that person, that exertional heat stroke person, isn't cooled quickly, then ultimately this could result in death. And so you can see the symptoms of exertional heat stroke. And usually the difference is the person with heat stroke is no longer sweating, although their skin still may have sweat on it, and they tend to be pale instead of flushed. Another heat illness is called rhabdomyolysis, and rhabdomyolysis is associated with heat. It's associated with dehydration. It's typically associated with very intense, often unfamiliar exercise. And so this, it used to be that you didn't hear so much about rhabdomyolysis, but with the increase in the popularity of CrossFit, and the workouts tend to be very intense, and they tend to be people that aren't as well trained, and they tend to be training people very intensely in a group environment. And this can cause dehydration, it can cause significant breakdown of muscle fibers, or this rhabdomyolysis condition. And what happens if you develop rhabdomyolysis is those muscle proteins are released into the blood and then filtered through the kidneys, and it can ultimately result in kidney failure and death. And so it's a very serious condition. So some of the factors that affect heat tolerance are age. Children tend to be more susceptible to heat illness because they sweat less, they have a higher core body temperature. Also, older adults tend to be more susceptible to heat illness because their ability to thermoregulate, their thermoregulatory receptors aren't as sensitive to rises in core body temperature, and so they tend to sweat later at a higher core body temperature. Also, women tend to be more susceptible to overheating than men because they tend to sweat less than men. They have less sweat glands. They also tend to have a larger surface area to body volume, and they also women tend to have more body fat because body fat is insulatory, and so when you're exercising, it increases the metabolic cost of exercise, and you generate more heat when you're exercising, and you're insulated by that body fat. Heat acclimation or acclimatization, your book uses them simultaneously. Heat acclimation in some circles is considered when you acute, like first few weeks adaptations to exercising in the heat, where heat acclimatization is when you've exercised for months to years in the heat. And so usually when you combine this with physical activity, that helps your body to adapt so that you're better able to maintain your core body temperature at that 37 degrees when you're exercising in the heat. And so heat acclimation or acclimatization, it can occur in by exercising just a few weeks in the heat. And so these are some of the physiological changes that you see by exercising in the heat. And so the first thing that happens is your plasma volume increases, and that reduces your heart rate, so that because it increases your stroke volume. It also increases your sweat rate, so that you're better able to cool your body when you become overheated. Also, your sweat concentration changes when you become acclimated to the heat, so that you lose less body sodium and chloride in your sweat, so that you better retain sodium and chloride. The other thing that happens is you have a better ability to move blood to your, or to increase skin blood flow. So your ability to dilate the cutaneous vessels, or the capillaries next to the skin, increases, so that you can lose more of that body heat into the environment via evaporative sweat losses or radiant heat, or conduction or convection, because that core body blood, that blood that's next to the heart, the lungs, the spinal cord, is moved, so it's warmed in the core, warmed in those active muscles, and then it's moved out into the periphery, and then that heat is lost into the environment. So that capacity increases when you're acclimated to the heat. And so these are some of the adjustments, physiological adjustments to acclimating in the heat. And so one of the first things that happens, like we said, is an increased plasma volume. Other things that happen is the exercise becomes less stressful in the heat, and so it's less less stressful. You lose less glycogen, and so we talked about how muscle glycogen is associated with fatigue. And so if you're sparing muscle glycogen, then you're going to be able to exercise for longer. And so acclimating to the heat allows you to exercise longer, and exercise longer specifically in the heat. You are able to sweat more, and you sweat at a lower core body temperature. If you want to, or if you decided that you'd like to acclimate to the heat, here are a couple of strategies, things that have been supported by research. That it's not required that you exercise daily in the heat. You can exercise once a day for 10 days, or you can exercise once every 3 days for 30 days, and both of those will give you the same level of heat acclimation. One will take 10 days and one will take 30 days, but both will give you the same level of heat acclimation. So it depends on your time frame and your tolerance for heat. Generally, it's recommended that the training in the heat should be pretty strenuous, like interval training or continuous aerobic training, greater than 50% of your VO2 max. Exercise should be pretty long duration, but up to 100 minutes. So exercising over 100 minutes in the heat per bout doesn't improve heat acclimation, but it should be kind of a long duration exercise in the heat. And if you stop exercising in the heat, then your body, those physiological adaptations are going to be lost, and so your body's going to lose the heat acclimation. The rate of heat acclimation loss is variable. It's believed that people that are more trained tend to lose the heat acclimation more slowly, although it's really, really variable. So some of the intervention strategies to prevent the excess elevation in core body temperature when you're exercising in the heat, things that people have tried to do to prolong the duration of exercise in the heat, or to improve exercise performance in the heat, are things like hyperhydration. And hyperhydration is when you are able to have greater than normal body water. And so usually this occurs by ingesting a substance like glycerol, which is banned by the World Anti-Doping Agency, or creatine, and that your body absorbs those substances into the plasma. They're absorbed intracellularly, and then they pull water into the cells. And so if you absorb these substances specifically before exercising in the heat, then you increase your total body water volume. And so the theory is that it protects against heat stress because it's going to delay dehydration because you have more body water. You're going to be able to sweat more when you exercise so that you're not going to have as much of a rise in core body temperature. The research suggests that hyperhydration is not consistently better than euhydration. And euhydration is just normal hydration before exercise in the heat. And so essentially, and people that try these hyperhydration strategies tend to feel puffy, they tend to feel bloated, and so that excess body weight as water can impair performance, and that bloating feeling can impair performance. So it's not one of the most commonly used strategies to promote or to prolong exercise in the heat. Another strategy is whole body pre-cooling, and so this essentially is an attempt to reduce peripheral body temperature so that it can absorb more heat from the core, and then that heat would be lost into the environment. And so essentially this is a strategy to try to prolong the time that that your body's able to lose heat by increasing the core body temperature to peripheral body temperature gradient, so that it takes longer for you to overheat or to reach a temperature where you're no longer able to exercise. And so the methods for whole body cooling, pre-cooling, are things like cold water immersion, things like cold air, things like a water-cooled garment. And so the cold water immersion is very uncomfortable. Cold air is very uncomfortable, and there's a limited amount for you to ability to cool the periphery. It's uncomfortable. You can cause tissue damage, and also if you're trying to do this in the middle of a marathon, in the middle of a heat, it's not really practical. And so generally, this is not thought to be a very practical way to prolong exercise in the heat, although some people try this. Another thing that you could use is clothing. So clothing that enhances evaporative sweat losses, so that pulls sweat to the periphery, so that it enhances evaporative sweat losses. Those kinds of, as compared to insulating clothing, those could potentially prolong the exercise duration in the heat. And so you can, so ideally, if you could exercise without any clothes, which I don't recommend this, but evaporative sweat losses would be very good if that was a possibility. And so you can select clothing that makes it more likely that you'll lose sweat into the environment. Another strategy is rehydration. And so if you have a good rehydration strategy while you're exercising in the heat, then that can prolong exercise and performance in the heat. And so some of the benefits of rehydrating while you're while you're exercising is that it's going to slow the rate of dehydration. If you can replace or at least slow the rate of fluid loss while you're exercising, you're going to slow the rate of dehydration. And so dehydration, you remember, is when your plasma becomes hyperosmotic, so you're losing body water, but you're not losing very much salt and chloride in the sweat, so your plasma becomes hyperosmotic and becomes hypovolemic. You have low plasma volume. And so that if you're rehydrating sufficiently, then it's going to help you to maintain plasma volume, and it's going to help to maintain your body's ability to lose heat, because circulation is going to be maintained. And so if you have 5 liters of blood, and that blood's going to be divided essentially between your active muscles, your heart, and your brain, and the skin, then if you're not losing as much plasma volume, that's going to better allow you to maintain blood flow to all of those areas, so that skin blood flow wouldn't be compromised as much. And we talked about how skin blood flow is really important to heat loss for radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. So the better your body's able to maintain skin blood flow, the better you're going to be at losing excess heat into the environment. But skin blood flow or skin blood flow regulation has a couple of competing items, and that you have to maintain blood pressure, specifically blood pressure to your brain and blood pressure to your heart. So you have baroreceptors that are working to maintain blood pressure, and so you have those baroreflexes that are directing blood to the heart, to the brain, and you also have reflexes that are directing blood to those active muscles and away from those inactive muscles. And then you can have the stress of heat gain, and so your blood flow, to regulate blood flow to the skin, or to regulate peripheral vasodilation to get more blood flow to the skin, you have to balance the needs of the rest of the body, the heart, the active muscle, versus the needs to cool the body. And so we talked about how your hypothalamus integrates all of those input to try to regulate heat loss and sweat rates and skin blood flow in the last lecture. So if you are sufficiently rehydrate, sweat levels are maintained, so you can still lose sweat as or you can still lose body heat as evaporation. And so this sufficient rehydration slows the rise in core body temperature, so that you're going to better able to exercise in the heat for longer periods of time. And so you can read through this list and see all of the benefits of maintaining fluid balance while you're exercising. And so you'll see that these benefits of rehydrating are very similar in many cases to the things that happen, or the benefits of heat acclimatization. So you have less rapid muscle glycogen depletion, you have better cardiac output, you have better plasma volume, and so all of these benefit exercise performance and exercise body cooling during exercise in the heat. So rehydration is a very, very important strategy to allow people to exercise and perform well in the heat. There's a couple of different things that impair or enhance rehydration, and these are the three main pieces that we have to think about when we're talking about rehydration. The rate of gastric emptying and things that affect gastric emptying. The rate of intestinal absorption, so very few things are absorbed from the stomach. So in order to absorb substances, they have to reach the intestine, and the rate of intestinal absorption is going to affect the rate of rehydration. And also the rate of fluid retention. So it wouldn't make sense if you drank a bolus amount of fluid, like an entire liter of water, and then that increased your plasma volume, stimulated your osmoreceptors in your hypothalamus, and then you peed it all out 30 minutes later. That doesn't help your rehydration. And so you have to think about how best to retain that body water, or that body fluid that you've tried to rehydrate with. So factors that affect rehydration, and specifically gastric emptying, are things like gastric volume. And so the larger the fluid that you intake, the faster gastric emptying is. And this is up to about a half of a liter, 600 milliliters of fluid. And so in gastric emptying rates have been shown to exceed 1 liter per hour. And so so it would be great if you could just take in a bunch of fluid and then exercise, and that would keep you rehydrated. But one thing that affects the volume of fluid that you can take in is how uncomfortable that makes you feel, or how comfortable you are exercising. And so usually the gastric volume, or the volume of fluid that you can take in while you're exercising, is limited by the comfortability of the athlete. So, but the more fluid you can take in, the more quickly your gastric volume will empty into your intestine. Also, carbohydrate composition of the drink affects gastric emptying, and that as the carbohydrate concentration in the solution that you hydrate with, and this is it affects the osmolality of the solution, as that increases, gastric emptying slows. And so for something that is has a greater than 7% carbohydrate solution, or greater than 300 milliosmoles, and so you remember 300 milliosmoles is the concentration of blood, but a greater than 7% carbohydrate solution slows gastric emptying. But one thing that you can do with a drink is you can either have glucose or simple carbohydrates, glucose, fructose, or you can have polymers of glucose, things like maltodextrin. And so if you have a larger polymer of glucose, it has a lower concentration than a simple carbohydrate solution. So you could potentially have a higher concentration of carbohydrates, but it have a lower osmolality if you're using something like maltodextrin versus something like glucose or sucrose in the solution. But although gastric emptying is slowed by the concentration of carbohydrates above 7%, intestinal absorption is enhanced by fluid intestinal absorption is enhanced by carbohydrate in the solution, because carbohydrate is absorbed, and it's absorbed via the glucose sodium transporter, and glucose and sodium are solutes that pull water into the intestinal epithelial cells, and so intestinal absorption of a variety of carbohydrates, so glucose, fructose, maltodextrin, they are absorbed by different transporters, and so they're going to pull more water. So carbohydrate in your rehydration solution enhances fluid absorption, and glucose is transported with sodium, so in the small intestine. Sodium is generally a good substance to have in the solution, and it was initially thought that the sodium in the rehydration solution would help to, because it's a solute, would help to pull more water into the intestinal epithelial cells, so you would absorb more water. But actually, it was suggested that up to about 50 millimoles, the amount of sodium in a solution doesn't affect intestinal absorption of fluid. And that's because the theory is that the pancreatic secretions in the small intestine actually are greater than the 50 millimoles. So up to 50 millimoles, there's not an enhance in intestinal reabsorption with sodium in the rehydration solution. But sodium in the rehydration solution does improve palatability, so people are more likely to drink it, and they're more likely to drink more of it. And sodium in the rehydration solution does improve fluid retention. So that was the third piece that we have to think about. It does improve fluid retention. So if you drink a fluid, it's more likely to be retained and less likely that you'll pee it out. It doesn't disrupt the osmolarity of the blood as much. Another thing that affects rehydration is exercise intensity or type. If the intensity is above 70% of your VO2 max, it slows gastric emptying. If you're doing something like running versus cycling, running slows your gastric emptying. So when you think about rehydration strategies, you have to think about what is the person doing and what is their tolerance for rehydration or rehydration fluids. And so this is showing different levels of sodium in the rehydration solution. So we said that sodium enhanced fluid retention, and so fluid retention is measured as urine volume. So if you just use your rehydrating solution and then you lose that all as urine volume, well then that's not going to be very good at rehydrating you. And so These are different concentrations of sodium in the rehydrating solution, so the same volume. So this is a very low, a 2 millimole sodium solution versus a higher level of sodium solution. And so what you see is up to about a 50 to 100 millimole solution. The sodium or the rehydrating solution is going to be better retained, so you don't lose as much of that as urine. So a moderate amount of sodium improves rehydration, and it helps to maintain a relatively high plasma volume, and this helps to a relatively high sodium plasma volume. Then this helps to maintain thirst drive, it helps to retain fluids, and it helps you to more rapidly, because you're drinking more, restore lost plasma volume when you're rehydrating. Another thing that affects gastric emptying and fluid delivery into the small intestine are things like carbonation of the solution. So soda pop slows gastric emptying, so it's not a good rehydration solution. Temperature of the solution. So other things that affect gastric emptying and core body temperature are temperature of the solution. And generally cool temperature solutions are believed to have greater heat storage capacity, so they're not as likely to increase core body temperature, and they might prolong exercise in the heat. The relative hydration status of the athlete affects the gastric emptying, so if a person is dehydrated, that's going to slow gastric emptying. And also the degree of mental stress. The more stressed you are, the less blood that's going to be devoted to your gastrointestinal tract for peristalsis and absorption of fluid, and so the more difficult or the slower your rehydration is going to be. So these are all the things that affect gastric emptying, and so things that we've talked about in the past, things like body, or things like solution protein and fat, and we talked about how protein and fat slow gastric emptying, and so you wouldn't want those in a rehydration solution. And they just talked about things like carbohydrate. We talked about volume, so you can kind of look at this figure to remind yourself of all the things that affect gastric emptying and rehydration. So pre-exercise, it's important to maintain or to have a sufficient fluid volume before you start exercising. So that's going to help you to better maintain plasma volume, electrolytes. It's going to allow you to provide more blood, to have more glycogen for your muscles to do their work. It's going to prevent abnormal elevations in heart rate, core body temperature. You're going to be better hydrated. But fluid consumption before exercise has to be individualized. It has to be individualized to the person's tolerance, their tastes, and their exercise. So you want to be thinking about all those things when you're recommending pre-exercise hydration strategies. And some practical pre-exercise hydration recommendations are to begin in a well-hydrated state. Generally consume about 3 to 5 mils per kilogram of body weight in water or some rehydration solution about 4 hours before exercise. You might want to eat a salty snack because that stimulates thirst, so you're more likely to drink. Check your hydration status, and so you can do this by checking your urine volume. And so this is a chart, and here's the citation, so you can look this up your own self if you'd like. And so you're looking at urine color, and so if you're 1, 2, or 3, then you're properly hydrated. But if you're these darker colors, then you're probably dehydrated, and so you don't want to start exercise in a dehydrated condition. The only caveat is if you're taking significant amounts of supplements that contain vitamins and minerals, you will lose those excess vitamins and minerals in your urine, and so that tends to cause your urine to appear more brightly colored than it normally would. And so if you're losing substances like vitamins and minerals in your urine, it makes it more difficult to assess hydration status using urine. So just know that. Also, if you're exercising in a hot environment, then specifically you should start consuming solution before you start exercising at about 250 to 500 mils every 10 to 20 minutes for the first hour to hour and a half before exercise. The fluids should contain some sodium or some salty snacks that'll help you to better maintain those solutions. And don't wait until you're thirsty to start drinking, because you've already lost 2% of your body water volume by that choice, or by that time. Carry fluids with you so that you're more likely, if you're carrying fluids, you're more likely to drink fluids. And plan to consume fluids at about 200 to 300 mils every 10 to 20 minutes while you're exercising. And avoid foods with a diuretic effect. And so caffeine affects people very differently. In some people it's very dehydrating, and some people it's not. So that whether you choose a solution with caffeine or not will depend on how caffeine affects you. So during exercise, it's important to take fluid in during exercise, especially endurance exercise in the heat, to maintain plasma volume, electrolyte volume, to prevent dehydration, to prevent hyponatremia or low sodium plasma volume, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to help you to better provide fluid to your working muscles, to avoid abnormal elevations in heart rate, core body temperature, remain hydrated. But again, rehydration strategies during exercise have to be individualized to the preferences of the person, their tolerance, their exercise, and their needs. And so here is a chart, and it's showing you essentially, so these are male and females, and these are different across different sports, and these are the sweat rates and the body fluid losses. And so the dark blue are the sweat rates. And so for some of these people, like male rowing and female rowers, they're losing 2 to 3 liters of sweat per hour. Gastric emptying rate, we said, can exceed 1 liter per hour. So at best, these individuals are able to replace or rehydrate it with 1 liter of fluid per hour. And so their sweat rates are double what they're able to rehydrate with. And so in many cases when you're exercising, you're not going to be able to meet your fluid losses in sweat with the rehydration solution. So you're going to become dehydrated to some extent. You want to avoid becoming dehydrated very much, but know that sweat rates vary, and generally you're not able to meet those sweat fluid losses with your rehydration. So you're going to become dehydrated. And also know that sweat rates vary. They vary by gender, they vary by sport, they vary by environment, and so rehydration strategies have to be tailored to the environment, the sport, the individual, time of day. So during exercise, there's large variations in sweat rate. So you're not able to give specific recommendations for fluid consumptions because sweat rate can be as much as 2 to 3 liters per hour. So prescribing always exactly how much to drink is difficult, although we said to try to drink between 200 and 300 mils of solution per every 10 minutes, but that depends on if it's a hot environment, if the person tolerates it well, and matching consumption, like we just saw, is to loss is difficult, and that's because gastric emptying rate is limited. And thirst is not a good indicator of dehydration, like we talked about before, because the onset of thirst often doesn't occur until you've lost a significant amount of blood volume. And so another thing that you have to think about when you're recommending fluid intake during exercise is so the ambient temperature and also the intensity of exercise. And so you can see how as ambient temperature goes up, fluid intake needs go up. Also, as exercise intensity increases, fluid intake should also increase to match, or at least attempt to match, demands. So during exercise, consume fluid to maintain a weight relatively constant. You'll probably lose some body water volume or body weight during exercise, and generally for every 450 mils of solution or sweat loss, you lose about a pound to exercise or during exercise, and you can lose up to 1 liter per hour. Try to drink small volumes of fluid. I misspoke, 120 to about 200 mils of fluid, so about 1 to 200 mils of fluid every 10 to 15 minutes, 10 to 20 minutes, especially when the environment's really hot. Have carbohydrates in the rehydration solution, active electrolytes, sodium chloride in the rehydration solution. That helps to improve performance, endurance, and during endurance exercise, also during intermittent exercise and team sports. And so it can become really challenging during intermittent exercise or during team sports to time fluid intake during those breaks in the action or in the game playing or in the performance. And so you just want to be aware of that. And you also, for the rehydration solution, you want to make sure that it's less than 6 to 7% carbohydrates, because greater than that slows gastric emptying rate. So if you have a slow gastric emptying rate while you're trying to exercise, that can become really uncomfortable. And before you do something in competition, always make sure you do it in performance. So practice even your rehydration strategy while you're training, so that you can mimic it during performance. So rehydration post-exercise, so this is really important. It's really important, especially if you're doing multiple bouts of exercise in a day, like a morning and an afternoon or a morning and evening. So if the recovery period's brief, rehydration strategies become even more important. And the recommendation is to ingest fluids with about 77 millimoles of sodium, or about a half of a gram per liter of sodium, and this is twice what's in most sports drinks, and this is rehydration. American College of Sports Medicine recommends a little bit higher concentration of sodium in the post-exercise rehydration solutions, and so they recommend about 0.5 to 0.7 grams of sodium per liter. Also include glucose and glucose polymers, simple carbohydrates, fructose in your fluids for rehydration, because that's going to help you to better replenish muscle glycogen. And as a general rule, you should ingest 150% or more of the weight that you lost during exercise. So for each 1.5 or for each kilogram that you lose during exercise, you should ingest post-exercise about 1.5 liters of water. So if you lose a half of a pound of exercise, or if you lose a half of a kilogram during exercise, then essentially you should take about 0.75 liters of fluid. So somewhere between a half of a liter and 0.75 liters. Post-exercise, consume fluid both as water and as food, and consumption may take, or rehydration may take between 4 and 24 hours to restore fluid volume. Consume solid foods, especially salty snacks. This helps you to stimulate you to drink. You can replenish potassium, but because you do lose some potassium as sweat, but generally it's recommended that you do that through foods and not a rehydration beverage. And so these are some of the options for you to restore potassium and also magnesium and calcium. Consume fluids over several hours so that you don't just pee it all out. And generally avoid alcohol content that's greater than 4%, because it reduces glycogen resynthesis, so that's going to delay your recovery. To assess your level of rehydration, you can do that by assessing body weight changes. How much weight did you lose? How much weight did you gain back post-exercise? Also, urine levels. Is your urine still dark, and does it have a strong low odor? Does it have a adequate volume? So you can look at those kinds of things. And so factors that are going to affect fluid intake are things like so color of the solution, the odor of the solution, the temperature of the solution, the sweetness of the solution. So you want to think about all of these factors when you're recommending rehydrating solutions, and you want to individualize that for your person. And so these are some commonly consumed sports drinks. And so here is Coca-Cola, and so you can see how Coca-Cola has a really, really low sodium content. It has a pretty high carbohydrate content, and that would slow gastric emptying, so it wouldn't be a good rehydration beverage. Things like, let's see, things like Gatorade. So Gatorade has a good amount of sodium, a good amount of carbohydrates, so that might be a really good beverage for rehydrating while you're working out. Something like these Powerades. So the Lucozade doesn't have any sodium, so it's probably not as beneficial. Some of these Powerades have a little higher, this one has a little higher sodium, higher carbohydrates. It's interesting that in the UK, in the US, they have different formulations of Powerade. But to some extent, so you want to use guidelines for how much sodium, how much carbohydrates, especially like pre-exercise, especially during exercise, to help to guide the selection and the solutions that you use for rehydration. But it's also going to depend on personal preference. So sports drinks are not always recommended during exercise. So if someone's trying to lose weight or they're doing exercise that's not in the heat, it's less than an hour long, you probably don't need a sports drink. And you may need water, but not a sports drink. Sports drinks are recommended during prolonged exercise, high intensity exercise, or intermittent training, especially in the heat. If the recovery time is short, like in 2-a-days or in preseason, if someone's less likely to be heat acclimated, during phases of poor nutrition, you're probably going to be more dehydrated, so probably recommended that you take a sports drink. If someone has a compromised immune function, or if you're exercising in the altitude or in the cold and you're not accustomed to exercising in the altitude or cold, and especially in competition. In competition, as long as you've practiced this during training, in competition, if you have a sufficient carbohydrate source, you're rehydrating sufficiently, that's going to reduce your perception of effort, and so that's going to make it feel easier, and so you're probably going to perform better. So sports drinks are not recommended. So like I said, exercise intensity is low, long session, or a session that lasts 60 to 90 minutes. The goal is to lose weight and not performance. The goal is to optimize fat metabolism. If your goal is to optimize fat metabolism, it doesn't make sense to replenish blood glucose levels so that then your body's more likely to use that blood glucose for energy than actually metabolizing fat. Also, if the athlete is well trained, they're exercising in a cool environment, or their recovery days or their off-season days, so they probably don't need a sports drink. So something like Gatorade or Powerade. Something that people are becoming more aware of is, so there's lots of recommendations for people to drink when they're exercising. So several years ago, I was on the AIDS ride, and so one of the things that people would tell you all the times in the AIDS ride was drink, 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 drink. And so, you actually can get something called, or something can happen called hyponatremia. And hyponatremia is low plasma sodium concentration. And so if you have a low plasma sodium concentration, and generally this is plasma levels below 135 millimoles. So usually plasma volume or plasma sodium is between 130 and 155 millimoles. But low plasma sodium can cause fluid to move into the brain, and it can cause the brain to swell. And because the brain tissue is restrained by the cranium, the hard bony cranium, the swelling can't go anywhere, so it compresses neurons. And it can cause symptoms like severe headache, vomiting, swollen hands, dehydration. Ultimately, it can cause a coma and death. And so these are hyponatremia, low sodium, and it causes the brain to swell. It's going to alter all of these systems. It's going to cause your heart to fail, and eventually coma and death, because fluid moves into your lungs, fluid moves into your central nervous system, your muscles not going to function as well. So hyponatremia is also called water intoxication, abnormally low sodium. It occurs when there's excess fluid intake relative to sodium intake. So if you're just drinking water frequently on a long run, a very, very long run in the heat, not replacing sodium, especially for someone that's on a low salt diet. So someone that's on a low salt diet, they're going to have lower blood sodium levels, and so their body may not sense that the low sodium levels. So it's easier for them to overconsume, or it's easier for them to overconsume fluid because their sodium levels are already low, because they're on a low sodium diet. And so draws water into the brain. Some of the risk factors for exercise-associated hyponatremia are prolonged exercise, especially in hot weather like ultra-endurance events. This happens quite frequently. Excessive fluid consumption greater than 1.5 liters per hour. When someone gains weight during exercise, that's very abnormal for a person to gain weight while they're exercising. So that's why you'll see during many of these ultra-endurance events, they'll have stations, and they will force the athletes to be weighed at these stations, because if they gain weight, then that's a signal that they could be, if they gain weight, they could be becoming hyponatremic, or hyponatremic. Couldn't say that word for a second. If they lose too much weight, then that could be indication that they're too dehydrated. So they weigh these athletes intermittently throughout these ultra endurance events. They're looking for weight gains, hyponatremia, and weight losses, significant dehydration. It happens, or it's more likely to happen in people that lose lots of sodium in their sweat. So we all have different numbers of sweat glands. We all have different levels of sweat in our salt, or different levels of salt in our sweat. And so some of us lose a lot of sodium in our sweat, and some of us lose not so much. Generally, people, as they become more fit, they lose less sodium in their salt, or less sodium in their sweat, and so they're better at conserving sodium. And so, but people that are less fit, they're on salt-free diets, then they lose sodium in their sweat, then it's more likely that they'll become hyponatremic. If people are using diuretic medications, especially for hypertension, then they're more likely to have low sodium levels, be on a low salt diet, and they can become hyponatremic. Also, people that have a slow running pace, so they're out there for longer. People that are smaller, so they're female gender. People that have a low BMI. And so in 2012, about 13% of the Boston Marathon finishers, so these are very fit people, they finished the marathon in some level of hyponatremia. So it's a really common thing to happen. But it's also a really dangerous thing. So, and you can just look at, this is just, so we've already talked about this, but essentially this just shows you what is happening in hyponatremia. So to prevent hyponatremia, 2 to 3 hours before exercise, drink about 400 to 600 mils of fluid. And so generally it should have carbohydrates, sodium. Drink about 150 to 300 mils of fluid before exercise. And make sure that you're not drinking over a liter of fluid per hour of praline water when you're exercising. So avoid drinking that much water. And add some sodium to each to the fluid that you're rehydrating with. And so don't drink just pure water. If you are someone who might be more at risk of having hyponatremia, and don't restrict dietary salt if you're performing exercise in the heat, you're an endurance athlete, and you're not hypertensive. So if you're on a low salt diet, make sure that your doctor knows about it, and make sure that it's consistent with your exercise goals, because you don't want to become hyponatremic because you're on a low sodium diet. And so generally, endurance athletes are not recommended to be on a low salt diet, low sodium diet. Although not as, this doesn't happen as frequently, you do lose fluid during winter sports through sweat. And so it's important to rehydrate during winter sports. And so you can lose water essentially via respiration, so you lose respiratory water. You can, and humidifying the air as it comes into your lungs requires more water. Excessive clothing can absorb the fluid, so you lose a lot of fluids via sweat. And you're also, because it's cold, your plasma volume is shifted more towards your core, so it causes your body to sense an increase in plasma volume, so you have to pee. And you also might be a little less likely, because it's cold, you have to take off all these clothes to rehydrate. So just be aware that people can overheat when they're exercising in cold environments. So don't ignore rehydration when you're exercising in cold environments. For children and adolescents, so like we said initially, children are less efficient thermoregulators than adults when they're exercising in warm environments. They also acclimatize to an environment or exercise in the heat much more slowly, and it takes them longer. So here's a general recommendation: 8 to 10 exposures for 30 to 45 minutes to acclimate to a new environment. They have a higher set point, so they don't start sweating until their temperature, the core temperature, is higher than adults. They have a lower sweat rate, so they get closer to their core body temperature and they don't sweat as much, and they produce more metabolic heat. And so they also have greater, because they don't have as much plasma volume, they have greater physiological impairment from dehydration. So being hydrated, rehydrating during and post-exercise is really important in kids. And so they become more dehydrated and overheat more than adults. So encourage kids to drink before, during, and so kids should be consuming fluids before, during, and exercise. So entering exercise well hydrated, well fed. During exercise, they should have plenty of opportunities to drink. You should reduce practice time during the heat, especially during having them in direct heat, so there should be plenty of shaded areas for breaks. Also, clothing that they're wearing, so whether they're wearing insulating clothing or using lots of equipment. And after exercise, make sure that they're rehydrating immediately. So give them lots of things that they want to rehydrate with, so pretzels, oranges, bananas, low-fat milk, smoothies, whatever will stimulate them to drink. The fluid, actually the sports drinks and energy drinks, tend to market directly to kids, and so there's a difference between sport drinks and energy drinks. And so sport drinks are usually flavored beverages. They contain carbohydrates, minerals, electrolytes, some vitamins. Gatorade, Powerade. These are generally not necessary for kids on a sports field or in a lunchroom. choose water unless they're exercising in the heat or they haven't eaten or some reason you think they're dehydrated. Then you can have them use sports drinks, or if they're more likely to consume fluids or rehydrate with sports drinks than with water. But you want to weigh this considering the obesity epidemic in kids right now. And so lots of these sports drinks have excess calories that and these are non-nutritive calories, and so they will promote obesity. And so for people to drink sports drinks while they're in class or while they're in the lunchroom doesn't make a lot of sense. And so generally, you don't always want to recommend for kids to consume sports drinks. You want to take the situation and the status of the child into consideration. Sports drinks in contrast to energy drinks. So energy drinks are usually drinks that contain stimulants, so things like caffeine, guarana, and they might have some carbohydrates, they might have proteins, they might have all these other substances, but one of the substances they do contain are these stimulants. And so for kids, kids' tolerance for these stimulants is much lower than for adults. And caffeine is in many of the fluids and foods that we consume, and so it's very easy for kids to overconsume these stimulants. So you just want to be aware and avoid having them consume energy drinks. Kids should not be consuming energy drinks. They can easily exceed their tolerable upper intake limit, and then they would potentially die. So, and the American Pediatric Society is currently debating whether they should have, or the recommendations that they should have, limiting kids' consumption of energy drinks. Whether energy drinks should have some kind of label on them to say avoid intake in people under this age. So, so things like Monster, Red Bull, they shouldn't be consumed by kids, and choose drinks that don't have excessive sugar, excessive calories, because they'll increase the rate of obesity, dental erosion, and so for more information, you can look at this reference. For older adults, so older adults are more sensitive to dehydration and heat illness, because they're less sensitive to changes in core body temperature. They have reduced sweat output. They tend to not be as well hydrated as younger individuals, and they're not as capable. Their body's not as physiologically capable of changing their blood flow as adeptly between active muscle and skin, and so their blood flow regulation is challenged, and they also don't recover as quickly from dehydration. So just be aware of that for older adults, that euhydration and fluid intake during and post-exercise can be more important. So you want to be aware of that if you're working with those adults. And so in conclusion, here was a runner. If you'd like to read about him, he was an avid runner. He was over the age of 60. He was running up Mount Diablo 7 times. It was an especially hot day. He was a well-trained runner, and he died likely due to dehydration. So, and his name was Rene Brulé. So I always say this lecture is in honor of him. But anyway, thank you for your attention, and I have a good luck in your exam, and thank you very much for your attention.